September 1945. Tokyo, the city does not sound like peace. It sounds like hunger. Wind moves through burned neighborhoods where walls no longer stand. Tin rattles. Ash drifts. Somewhere, a baby cries. Thin, exhausted, barely alive. Japanese mothers sit on the ground where their homes once were. They cradle infants wrapped in scraps of cloth. Many have not eaten properly in days. Some have stopped producing milk altogether. Hospitals lie flattened. Doctors are dead, missing, or without supplies. Clean water is uncertain. Disease waits patiently. Then boots appear at the end of the street. American boots. The same nation whose bombers turned these cities into firestorms now walks through the ruins carrying medical bags. U.S. Army medics kneel beside women who only weeks earlier were taught to fear them. They lift babies weighing barely 5 pounds. They mix powdered milk with purified water. They check pulses. They mark records. The mothers do not speak. They watch, stunned. No victory banners hang here. No speeches are made. Only quiet hands working against time. In the wreckage of total war, something unexpected begins. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness, but survival. And it begins with the smallest lives, in a country brought to its knees. To understand how this moment became possible, we must step back into the world Japan surrendered from. The world Japan surrendered from, 1937 August 1945. By the summer of 1945, Japan was no longer a functioning modern state. It was an exhausted empire in collapse. For nearly 8 years, the nation had been at war. Since 1937, Japan's economy, industry, and population had been mobilized for total conflict, first in China, then across the Pacific. By 1944, that effort had consumed nearly everything. American submarines strangled shipping lanes. Food imports collapsed. Coal shortages crippled railways and hospitals. Urban civilians survived on ration cards that promised calories the system could no longer deliver. Then came the fire. Beginning in late 1944 and intensifying in 1945, the United States launched a strategic bombing campaign unlike anything Japan had faced. The March 9th to 10th firebombing of Tokyo alone killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people in a single night. By August, more than 60 Japanese cities had been partially or completely destroyed by incendiary raids. Hospitals burned alongside homes. Medical schools vanished with their staff inside. Midwives, nurses, and physicians were killed, displaced, or left without equipment. Civil defense plans failed. Evacuation systems collapsed. Public health infrastructure disintegrated. For infants, the consequences were immediate and severe. Even before surrender, Japan's infant mortality rate had risen sharply. Malnutrition weakened mothers during pregnancy. Low birth weight became common. Breastfeeding failed when women themselves were starving. Diseases long kept at bay returned in force. Measles, dysentery, tuberculosis, and pneumonia spread rapidly through overcrowded shelters and burnt-out neighborhoods. Clean water systems lay in ruins, contaminating what little food remained. By August 1945, thousands of babies were dying every week. And still, the war continued. On August 6th, Hiroshima was destroyed. On August 9th, Nagasaki followed. The Soviet Union entered the war the same day, shattering any remaining hope of negotiated survival. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito spoke to the nation for the first time. The war was over. But surrender did not bring relief. It exposed the full scale of collapse. Japan faced the coming winter with little fuel, minimal food reserves, and a civilian population already weakened beyond recovery. Transportation networks barely functioned. The harvest was poor. Imports were non-existent. Most dangerously, there was no national plan to save the youngest generation. The imperial government still existed, but it no longer controlled the conditions of survival. That responsibility now rested with the occupying power, an American force preparing to land not as conquerors, but as administrators of a broken nation. And as Allied ships approached Japan's shores, the crisis facing its infants was about to move from national tragedy to international responsibility. Occupation, collapse, and the first days of contact, August-October 1945. When American forces began landing in Japan in late August 1945, they entered a country that was quiet, but not calm. There were no widespread uprisings, no organized resistance, only exhaustion. Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, General Douglas MacArthur, assumed control on August 30, 1945. His mandate was clear: demilitarize Japan, prevent famine, and stabilize a society on the brink of humanitarian disaster. Early intelligence reports were grim. U.S. Army Civil Affairs officers estimated that millions of civilians were at risk of starvation during the coming winter. Infant mortality figures, though incomplete, alarmed medical planners almost immediately. Japan's public health system had effectively ceased to function. Over 90% of Tokyo's hospitals were damaged or destroyed. Medical supply depots were empty. Electricity was intermittent. Sterilization equipment was non-existent. Midwives worked without gloves, disinfectant, or reliable water. The American occupation forces had anticipated resistance and sabotage. Instead, they found mothers lining up silently at makeshift aid points, holding infants too weak to cry. The U.S. Army Medical Corps and Navy medical units were quickly redirected from combat readiness to emergency civilian relief. Field hospitals, originally intended for Allied troops, were repurposed. Mobile medical teams were formed to move through urban ruins. Milk became a priority. Japanese infants had long relied on breastfeeding, but widespread maternal malnutrition had collapsed that system. In response, occupation authorities authorized the importation of powdered milk, vitamin supplements, and basic pediatric medicines. Distribution centers were established in schools, temples, and surviving municipal buildings. American medics recorded weights, ages, and symptoms. Babies under critical thresholds were hospitalized or given priority feeding. Vaccination campaigns against smallpox and typhus began almost immediately, despite shortages. Cultural barriers complicated every interaction. Many Japanese mothers had been warned that American soldiers were brutal and cruel. Some bowed deeply before approaching medical stations. Others hesitated, fearing punishment or humiliation. Language differences slowed treatment. Gestures replaced words. Records were kept in English and Japanese where possible. Yet necessity overcame fear. As weeks passed, survival replaced ideology. Mothers returned repeatedly to the same aid points. Infants who had been skeletal in September gained weight by October. Disease rates, while still high, began to stabilize in certain districts. Occupation reports noted something unexpected. There was no hostility at the medical stations. No sabotage. No violence. Instead, there was cooperation, fragile, cautious, but growing. American medics, many of whom had treated battlefield casualties only months earlier, now found themselves working 12-hour days feeding newborns and instructing Japanese nurses on sterilization techniques. This was not charity in the abstract. It was logistics, planning, and constant triage, performed under the knowledge that failure would mean mass death among those least responsible for the war. By autumn 1945, the survival of Japan's infants had become a measurable objective of the occupation itself. And within this fragile system, a single reality emerged. The same moment could be seen very differently, depending on where one stood. Survival seen from the ground angle 1. The human reality. Mothers and infants for Japanese mothers in late 1945. Survival narrowed to a single calculation. Was the baby still breathing in the morning? Many women had given birth during air raids. Some delivered in basements. Others in evacuation shelters or burnt-out homes. Few had access to trained medical care. Food rations for civilians averaged well below subsistence levels. Pregnant and nursing women received no meaningful priority during the final months of the war. By surrender, many mothers were themselves emaciated. Infants were born underweight. Weak immune systems made them vulnerable to infections that would have been routine in peacetime. Diarrheal disease alone killed thousands. When American medical stations appeared, they disrupted everything these women had been taught to expect. There were no interrogations, no punishments, only measurements, feeding schedules, and careful hands. Some mothers wept openly when powdered milk was placed into their arms. Others watched in silence as U.S. medics fed their children with improvised bottles. For many, this was the first time since surrender that survival felt possible. The shock was not kindness, it was competence. Systems functioned. Supplies appeared regularly. Records were kept. The war had taught these women that enemies destroyed. Now enemies stabilized. And that contradiction lingered in every feeding line. Angle 2. The medical perspective. U.S. Army medics and nurses for American medical personnel. Japan in 1945 was unlike any theater they had served in. There were no front lines, no evacuation chains, no enemy fire. Instead, there were statistics and children. Army doctors reported infant weights far below healthy ranges. Cases of beriberi, caused by vitamin deficiency, appeared in both mothers and infants. Tuberculosis spread rapidly through crowded housing. Many medics improvised constantly. Glass bottles were scarce. Rubber nipples were sterilized and reused repeatedly. Canvas tents became neonatal wards. U.S. military medicine, developed for mass casualties, now focused on prevention. Feeding schedules replaced surgical triage. Clean water became as important as antibiotics. This work lacked the drama of combat. There were no medals for keeping babies alive. But among medical units, morale rose as infant survival rates improved. Progress could be measured in grams gained, fevers broken, and cries growing louder. For soldiers trained to destroy, this shift carried its own psychological weight. Angle 3. The psychological divide. Fear, shame, and silence. Even as aid expanded, emotional barriers remained. Many mothers avoided eye contact. Years of propaganda had warned them of abuse and cruelty. Some feared their children would be taken away. At the same time, defeat carried deep shame. Accepting help from a former enemy was not easy. American soldiers sensed this tension. Orders emphasized restraint, discipline, and professionalism. Interactions were kept formal, almost ritualistic. Over time, repetition softened fear. Daily visits replaced first encounters. Trust was built slowly, measured not in words, but in survival. And as these individual experiences accumulated, the response began to move beyond improvised compassion towards something more organized and deliberate. From individual acts to policy and meaning. Angle 4. Leadership and policy. Health as occupation strategy. At the highest level of the occupation, infant survival was not treated as a symbolic gesture. It was a strategic necessity. General MacArthur and his staff understood that famine and disease could destabilize Japan faster than political resistance. Public health became a cornerstone of occupation policy. The Civil Affairs and Public Health section of SCAP prioritized maternal and infant care in its earliest directives. Japanese health officials were ordered to cooperate fully with American medical authorities. Data collection was standardized. Reporting systems were rebuilt. Occupation planners understood a critical truth. A generation lost to malnutrition would cripple any post-war recovery. Milk distribution programs expanded nationally by early 1946. Vaccination campaigns reached millions of children. Japanese midwives were retrained using updated medical protocols. This was not charity alone. It was governance. And it carried consequences. Angle 5. The moral dimension. Former enemies. Shared vulnerability. The war in the Pacific had been brutal beyond measure. Mutual dehumanization had defined its final years. Yet in occupied Japan, American soldiers now knelt beside Japanese civilians in moments of extreme vulnerability. There were no ideological speeches in these interactions. No attempts at conversion or persuasion. Only practical action. For many soldiers, this work reframed their understanding of the war's end. The enemy was no longer abstract. It had a heartbeat. It cried. These moments did not erase the war. They did not absolve responsibility or suffering. But they complicated memory. And they introduced a moral tension that neither side had anticipated. Angle 6. Perception shift. When fear quietly changed by mid-1946, occupation reports noted a subtle transformation. Crowds at medical stations grew. Fear receded. Mothers began bringing infants earlier, before symptoms became critical. Japanese nurses worked side by side with American personnel. What had begun as emergency relief was becoming routine care. The shock was no longer that Americans were helping. The shock was that the help was consistent. And consistency created trust. That trust would be tested during the hardest period of all, the winter when survival hung by a narrow margin, and failure would have been impossible to hide. Winter 1945 to 1946, the edge of survival. The winter arrived early. By December 1945, temperatures dropped across Honshu as Japan faced its most dangerous season since surrender. Fuel shortages left homes unheated. Rail networks barely functioned. Food reserves were critically low. For infants, cold multiplied every existing risk. Malnutrition weakened immune systems further. Respiratory infections spread rapidly through overcrowded housing. Cases of pneumonia surged. Diarrheal diseases continued unchecked in districts without clean water. Occupation medical officers warned that infant mortality could spike catastrophically. Some projections feared losses comparable to wartime casualties, this time without bombs. The response was immediate and unprecedented. U.S. military logistics were redirected. Ships carrying occupation supplies now included large quantities of powdered milk, cod liver oil, vitamin supplements, and pediatric medicines. Emergency feeding stations expanded operating hours. Mobile medical teams were sent into rural and urban districts previously unreached. Trucks moved through snow and rubble alike. Medics recorded names, weights, and symptoms under canvas shelters and damaged school roofs. Vaccination campaigns intensified. Despite shortages, smallpox inoculations continued. Typhus control teams sprayed disinfectants and isolated outbreaks. The work was exhausting. Medics slept in shifts. Records were handwritten in freezing conditions. Improvisation was constant. Yet the data began to shift. In several Tokyo wards, infant mortality stabilized by January 1946. In Yokohama and Osaka, weight gain among previously critical infants was documented within weeks. Japanese health officials, initially sidelined, were fully integrated into operations. Local midwives became essential links between families and medical stations. Information moved faster. The winter did not end the crisis, but it slowed the descent. And for the first time since surrender, survival was measurable. What followed would determine whether this fragile improvement was temporary or the beginning of a lasting transformation. Spring 1946, evidence of life amid ruin. By March 1946, reports began to show tangible results. Infant mortality rates, which had soared in the autumn and early winter, were declining in districts receiving sustained aid. Data from the U.S. Army Medical Corps documented a 20 to 30% reduction in deaths among infants under 1 year old in Tokyo and Yokohama. Field medics noted patterns. Babies who had been skeletal and lethargic in December now gained weight steadily. Rashes cleared. Coughs eased. Cry patterns normalized. A small, profound signal that life was winning. Japanese mothers were no longer silent observers. They learned feeding techniques, proper sterilization, and how to measure growth. Many returned daily to stations, bringing multiple infants from their extended families. Trust, built slowly, was now resilient. The occupational authorities formalized these programs. Temporary feeding stations became permanent clinics. Emergency hospitals for infants were staffed with Japanese and American nurses working side by side. Training manuals were translated into Japanese. Logistics became precise. Powdered milk, vitamin drops, and vaccines were distributed according to schedules based on recorded weights and age. Disease outbreaks were contained more effectively. Measles mortality fell. Dysentery incidents decreased in districts with sustained clean water distribution. Vaccination campaigns reached over 1 million children by mid-1946, according to SCAP reports. Symbolic moments punctuated this work. One widely cited account describes a Tokyo mother, previously too weak to feed her child, standing beside a U.S. medic as her baby latched and gained its first pound in weeks. Another report notes Japanese nurses quietly applauding as rows of infants received morning feeds without incident. For the occupation, this was more than a humanitarian success. It validated a principle: systematic, disciplined intervention could save lives, rebuild trust, and stabilize a society devastated by total war. By late spring 1946, the worst winter had passed. The infants who survived were now living proofs that the collaboration, unlikely, fragile, and born from necessity, worked. And yet, the story did not end with survival alone. The consequences of this effort would reverberate across Japanese society and the U.S. occupation itself, reshaping health policy, memory, and international responsibility. Survival, rebuilding, and early consequences, 1946 to 1947. By mid-1946, Japan had begun to stabilize in ways unimaginable just months earlier. Infant mortality, which had spiked dangerously in late 1945, had declined significantly in urban districts served by occupation medical teams. SCAP reports documented clear improvements. Tokyo wards that had recorded infant deaths in the hundreds per month saw those numbers fall by 25 to 40%. Hospital admissions for malnutrition began to decrease. Emergency feeding stations, once temporary, became semi-permanent clinics. Japanese medical personnel, previously operating in a fractured system, now collaborated with U.S. counterparts. Midwives were retrained under modern hygiene protocols, and basic pediatric record-keeping was standardized. Occupational authorities emphasized consistent monitoring, recognizing that survival depended on ongoing care rather than sporadic aid. The impact was both practical and cultural. Mothers, once fearful of American soldiers, became familiar with their presence in daily life. Reports from civil affairs officers noted the quiet astonishment and relief among families. Many Japanese mothers had never imagined that former enemies would dedicate themselves to the care of their most vulnerable children. The simple act of feeding and vaccinating infants challenged deep-seated fears and reshaped perceptions. Emergency programs also influenced urban planning. Rehabilitation of hospitals, repair of water systems, and the introduction of vaccination campaigns became integrated into broader reconstruction efforts. The occupation's initial focus on survival laid the foundation for Japan's post-war public health system, which would later be regarded as one of the most effective in the world. Yet, the crisis was far from over. Rural areas remained difficult to reach. Winter shortages, sporadic typhoid outbreaks, and famine in isolated regions meant that aid had to be continuous and adaptive. The occupation forces learned to balance logistics, politics, and diplomacy. Every intervention measured against both life and stability. The human toll, however, was clear. Thousands of infants had already died before programs reached them. But the data showed something remarkable. Intervention could reverse trends in mortality, even in a society devastated by total war. As the first year of occupation drew to a close, survival became measurable. What followed would reveal the deeper consequences, social, political, and psychological, of this unprecedented humanitarian effort. Long-term effects and lasting transformation, 1947 to 1952. By 1947, Japan's post-war recovery had entered a new phase. The emergency measures that once seemed extraordinary became integrated into national policy. Feeding stations evolved into public health clinics. Vaccination programs were maintained and expanded. Japanese nurses and midwives trained under occupation guidance now led much of the work independently. Statistical evidence confirmed the impact. Infant mortality in occupied urban districts fell from approximately 70 deaths per 1,000 live births in 1945 to 45 per 1,000 by 1947. Reports cited the successful reduction of diseases like measles, dysentery, and tuberculosis in areas with sustained intervention. Nutrition programs for mothers improved breastfeeding success and birth outcomes. For Japanese society, the psychological and cultural implications were profound. Many mothers remembered not just the survival of their children, but the very presence of soldiers who had once been enemies, kneeling in the date, carefully feeding newborns. Stories circulated in neighborhoods and extended families, passed down as accounts of wonder and disbelief. Americans, once feared, had saved lives. The U.S. military also absorbed lessons from this period. Civil affairs and medical corps personnel reported that structured humanitarian intervention could stabilize societies, prevent disease, and foster trust, even between former enemies. These lessons would later inform U.S. policies in post-war Europe, Korea, and other reconstruction efforts. Occupational documents and Japanese recollections both highlight the moral complexity of the era. It was a time when victory and destruction were inseparable from care and compassion. The act of saving infants, feeding them, vaccinating them, nurturing them back to strength, became emblematic of a broader transformation, the potential for healing in the aftermath of total war. By 1952, as occupation formally ended, Japan had laid the foundations for a public health system capable of sustaining its population. The infants who survived under the watchful care of American medics were now toddlers, living testaments to what disciplined humanitarian intervention could achieve. And for mothers who had once sat in silence among the ruins, the memory of survival was entwined forever with the presence of those unexpected protectors. The story of life saved amid devastation leads naturally into reflection. What this episode reveals about humanity, war, and the fragile bridge between destruction and care. The war had left Japan in ashes, yet in those ruins, life endured. Infants who should have been lost survived. Mothers, once filled with fear, held their children with disbelief and gratitude. American soldiers, trained to destroy, found themselves as agents of survival, bridging a chasm created by their own nation's bombs. This moment is paradoxical yet profound. It illustrates the capacity for humanity to persist even when nations are enemies. Destruction and mercy coexisted side by side, firestorms above, care and nourishment below. The smallest lives became symbols of both vulnerability and resilience. The episode reshaped Japan's post-war trajectory. Public health systems were rebuilt. Trust, once unimaginable, grew between former foes. The survival of a generation was secured not merely through politics, but through deliberate, disciplined action, feeding, vaccinating, measuring, and protecting. And it reminds us that war does not end with surrender. Its consequences ripple into everyday life, into kitchens, hospitals, and mothers' arms. Humanity often survives in these intimate, quiet moments, long after the guns fall silent. In the end, the story is not just about survival. It is about what is possible when compassion is paired with organization, when enemies choose to preserve life rather than perpetuate fear. It is about the fragile bridge between destruction and care, and the enduring lesson that even amid the horrors of war, hope can emerge in the smallest, most astonishing ways. The babies who survived, the mothers who wept in relief, and the soldiers who served quietly in the rubble became part of a larger truth, that humanity, even in its darkest hour, is capable of saving itself. The echoes of this moment continue to remind us that the measure of victory is not destruction alone, but the lives preserved, and the trust rebuilt in its aftermath.